Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from the science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic.
Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. Of all the iconic images associated with Thelema, the most primal, sacred, and important is the Stelé of Revealing, a funeral stele dedicated to an Egyptian priest of the late 25th, early 26th dynasty, Ank-f-n-Khonsu. Edward and I will discuss this ancient depiction of the Thelemic Trinity. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under rule.
Welcome back as always, Edward. How are you doing?
I am doing reasonably here on a sunny afternoon in Mexico. Weather is kind of predictable at the moment, sunny. Otherwise than that, no particular complaints.
Yeah, what do we have on the docket for our discussion today?
Well, a couple of weeks back, actually maybe longer than that, I was in my temple finishing up and thinking, I bet that guy at Darkly Splendid Abodes is going to get on the message to me soon and say, so do you want to record a talk? And I thought, I've got nothing whatsoever to talk about. So I was staring up at the copy of the stele that I have in my temple thinking, okay, inspire me. And it occurred to me, you haven't actually talked about the stele itself, have you? Why don't you do something on that? So I started looking at the various reflections I have about the thing.
Well, that's good. I'm glad that we've gotten to the point where you're you have to look around at objects around the room. That's kind of fun. That's like the only level of I love lamp.
Exactly. Well, that was actually the thing that occurred to me, because it's like, look, how much of what comes to us as the Thelemic current is actually coming through that eidolon, that image up there. You know, this is a photocopy that I pasted on foam board years ago. It's lived with me in 3 or 4 different places. And how much is myself? And of course, that's one of those issues that you think you've resolved for yourself as a magician, then it comes back again at various times. Mm-hmm. If you start out in magic really skeptical, then at some point, something happens that seems to have come at you from outside of anything you regard as yourself or your own psyche. Alternatively, if you're a true believer that it's all these spirits out there, they are objective phenomena, you also have a moment where you suddenly realize a lot of the objective phenomena are the same thing as the subjective phenomena that are happening inside yourself. Mm-hmm. So by the time you've done enough Thelemic magic, you're completely befuddled, and you find yourself staring at the, as I said, a photocopy of the Stelé of Revealing, saying, okay, what am I going to talk about next time? Mm-hmm. So that I really got off on this for a while with this kind of tennis match in my head. How much of this is real in the sense of an objective thing coming at us? How much is subjective? And of course, the resolving third factor is, why do you think these two things are separate? Which, of course, I can never resolve entirely for myself, because some phenomena have to be experienced as subjective. Some phenomena have to be experienced as objective, and magicians play around with this all the time. Then I started looking at something that haunted me from a while back. Years ago, I noticed when I was really intensely into my practices, it was if this stele, and I've had it for a couple of decades now, it's a bit battered and knocked around on the corners, seemed to have a kind of orangey glow, whereas usually it's a kind of brownish yellow. So I thought that was a subjective thing that indicated I was kind of in the zone and ready to, do some magical magic. Then one time, my then teacher said to me, when you see the stele clairvoyantly, it has a kind of orange glow to it, a solar orange glow. And I went, oh, some similar sort of noise. Okay, so there's this relationship that we have through the stele and with the stele. So for this talk, I started digging a bit more back into the story, which everybody knows, and yet there are things about it that perhaps we overlook. First thing, of course, is that we know it all happens in Cairo, where Crowley is there with Rose, and he's trying to be the Hiwa Khan, this exotic gentleman about town, and he's taking a few lessons in Islam from a Sufi sheikh. And then Rose goes into this strange thing where they're waiting for you. It's all about the child. And to finally shut her up, he marches her off to the museum, which he says was the Bulak Museum, but I think some people have looked in the dates of the time. They think the Bulak Museum was either emptied out or about to be emptied out at that point. So they really went to the main museum in Cairo, which is finally transitioned to this brand new multi-billion-dollar showcase that they've put up. Anyway, there she is. She leads Aleister past all of these images of Horus that she's been talking about and takes him up to this exhibit number 666, which, of course, impresses him, and the story unfolds from there. The key thing that struck me in that was, we take the Book of the Law as kind of the foundation of Thelema. It's got all of these Kabbalistic riddles and puzzles and instructions and gematria problems. But really everything starts with this fairly basic image that gives us Nuit round the perimeter of the stele, Horus Bedeti or Horus Hadid or whatever, floating there up in the top with these wings extended from the red solar disk. And underneath you've got Ra-Harakti or Ra-Horkut or various renderings of his name being greeted by Ank-f-n-Khonsu, telling him, hey, you're such a cool guy. I brought you a whole load of gifts to put on this table. These things are fairly common in that period of Egypt, these steles. Apparently this one was found in a cache of the things at Deir el-Bahri, which is opposite the modern town of Luxor, used to be known as Thebes. And it was taken into what was then this Bulak Museum. I don't know what's happened to that structure. I imagine it's gone now in the past 120 years. Anyway, it is in the custody of this character, Emile Bruch, who lived from 1842 to 1930. Now, archaeology was still becoming an entirely respectable profession at this point. Howard Carter, the guy who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun with Lord Carnarvon's money, was an antiquities dealer as well as an archaeologist. And there have been modern suggestions that he did some slightly dicey trading of some of the excess stuff they got out of the tomb of Tutankhamun. I know some Ushabti figures were found in a concealed cupboard in Lord Carnarvon's home a few years ago, which seemed to imply something funny was happening. Anyway, Mr. Bruch was quite possibly an antiquities pilferer. He was German. Sorry, I think I might have said he was Belgian, but he was German. And he was up for anything that advanced his own position. So I'm suggesting Crowley probably offered some money to pay for what he wanted, which was a translation of this stele when Bruch was not willing to sell it to him. You remember the whole thing about attaining obstruction of the stele from the ill-ordered house. I often think that phrase, ill-ordered house, in the 3rd chapter of the Book of the Law, might be a reference to the way Bruch actually ran things. It was a little bit sloppy because it's easier to move stuff out if you're a slightly light-fingered gentleman. Anyway, Bruges was not going to do a translation himself. He called in a French assistant whose name I couldn't track down, but it's probably known somewhere, and said to the guy, you need to do a translation of the Stelé. And my copy of the Holy Books has 3 different translations in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy's French translation looks like it was a bit amateurish. He didn't really know an awful lot about how to translate words. In particular, you see the offering table, and there's an offering there of beef, fowl, bread, and then there's a jar. And that jar has been taken to represent, in the different translations, water, beer, and wine. It's something that every translator sees differently. It's an ideogram, I think. That's one of these symbols that is a word all on its own, and they haven't put an alphabetical spelling underneath it that would have clarified exactly what would have been in the thing. I think it unlikely that anybody would offer water to a god other than a Christian god. More likely beer, which was considered cool stuff in Egypt, and quite possibly wine, which was a little bit more upscale. Mm-hmm. So that's what Ank-f-n-Khonsu, who of course is deceased when this stele was produced, offers to the guy. Now, staring at the stele as well, the other thing that always strikes me is there's a line dividing Hadith up at the top there, the winged red disc, from the scene with Horus and Ank-f-n-Khonsu. I guess Ank-f-n-Khonsu's family did this on the cheap a bit because it slants down from the left to the right, whether it's in a reproduction or when you see photos of the original thing. And I think, could you not have got a guy who didn't have a visual problem and who could have drawn a straight line? This has bothered me now for 30 years. And of course, there's nothing we can do about it because the thing has been
a little late.
It's a little late to go and fix it. But I do wish they had done something there. Anyway, below that, there's a chunk of one of the chapters of the Book of the Dead. And on the back, there's a kind of personal life testament of the deceased Ank-f-n-Khonsu saying, I had a pretty cool life overall. I did the best I could, and I worshipped, and I am the son of wise Taneshi, and Besnamot is my dad. That's an interesting little bit there, because a lot of people, when I first got into Thelema, they told me, wise Tanesh. See, it's wise because it pertains to Hokmah, the Sephira of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And Tanesh must have been his dad. Bezenmut or Besnamot. Mut is a goddess name, and therefore that's his mother. Now, this is in fact the other way around. Wise Tanesh or Taneshi was the guy's mum. There's a female determinative sign after the spelling of that name, and Bezenmut was his dad. And people also used to try and persuade me that since in the translation Crowley published and used in the adorations that he produced, Besnamot, M-A-U-T, which of course would have been the French way of saying mot or mut, it's really Ma'at, which it isn't at all. It's the reference to the vulture goddess Mut, who is the consort of the god Amun, the god of Thebes. All kinds of things that you need to unpack and flip around if you're going to see exactly what's on this thing. There isn't a lot in the stele wording that I think is particularly relevant to Thelema, other than the images on the front. And that's the power of this thing. You've got it right there. You have Nuit all the way around the top. You've got the Bedate or Hadith disc up there at the top, flying towards her for unity. And underneath you have Rahu, Rahurakte or Rahukut or Rahukuhit, or people always came up with different ways of rendering it as the knowledge of the ancient Egyptian language developed, and as people realized how spellings and stuff changed over the thousands of years of Egyptian history. So that's the actual thing from a historical perspective. It's a little bit muddlesome. And Crowley, I think, models it a bit more with the adorations he came up with, where he just allowed himself the freedom to reinterpret and recreate the wording in ways that suited his view of the universe at that particular time, which, as we know, he was kind of turned off most things spiritual. He'd done his Golden Dawn stint. Okay, cool stuff, but, it only takes you so far. He got into Buddhism with Alan Bennett and Anda Matea, but he was getting kind of turned off that one. He'd had his yoga intensive in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and had that amazing vision he had of this incredible rising sun, which kind of drained all of his spiritual aspiration for a while. So he was a kind of a guy of his times who was rather cynical, rather dismissive, a bit world-weary, but
one of them damned existential nihilists, I guess.
Exactly, one of those people who, of course, in that 2-week period at the end of March and beginning of April 1904, had all of the foundations of his current perspective blown apart. And then he had to spend another 3 years when he had this Book of the Law thing, trying to figure out what the heck is this all about. And before he and George Cecil Jones actually founded the AA, and even then they didn't put the Book of the Law centrally into it for some years after that. Anyway, that's the thing as a physical object.
Mm-hmm.
So, we could say more about that, perhaps, but I don't know whether you've got any comments at this point.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting to dive into some of the background of it because, there is some of it's more obvious, but then some of the actual background that you've been referring to is kind of interesting to get some take on as well. The fact that Crowley's paraphrase, for instance, is much more flowery and maybe not representative of an actual literal translation or anything like that. But at the same time, he's directed during the writing of the Book of the Law to insert portions of his paraphrase into the Book of the Law. So that kind of speaks to the fact that instead of being like an archaeological or, a resurgence of literally what was being included on the stele, what's being channeled through in the Book of the Law is something specific to the context in which it's being received.
Indeed. I also think that sort of cynical, nihilistic, existentialist person, when you get into that kind of mentality, on the one hand, it's blocking certain spiritual insights. On the other hand, you don't notice the side of yourself that is more intuitive, and it's kind of easier for stuff to sneak through.
Mm-hmm.
Insight can be very serpentine. It sneaks through the cracks, and you don't realize it's happened until it's overwhelmed you and knocked you flat. So I think that was perhaps a contributing factor. And he was, his description says Rose was the one who was becoming rather strange. He was obviously being enticed into sharing this experience, at least to the point he says, okay, I'll do exactly the invocation that you tell me I've got to do just to show you that such things can't possibly work if you break all the standard rules. Yes, I'll stand on the balcony of our apartment and make a fool of myself. And, of course, that leads to the opening of the door. And Aiwass is there dictating as he scribbles and scribbles and scribbles the Book of the Law down. It's always interesting to me to look at the little bits where Rose added the stuff he hadn't heard correctly and couldn't get down.
Mm-hmm.
Her handwriting is so distinctly neat and well-mannered, whereas he's just scrawling across the page and you read the photocopies. And I think if I didn't have the printed version of the Book of the Law, I couldn't read his handwriting.
Yeah.
It's just really, gabble, 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 running across. which says something, I think, about the dynamics between them, that he was, in fact, working very rapidly on a mental plane, whereas she was not caught up in this. She didn't have this whole background he had of the seeker he was before he found the Golden Dawn, then all of that Golden Dawn training, then all the stuff he'd done with Alan Bennett, then the stuff in Sri Lanka, and other stuff he'd done along the way, because he was still kind of tinkering with the esoteric teachings between that Sri Lankan experience and the Cairo event. And they had gone into the Great Pyramid, into the King's Chamber, in order to do the invocation of the sylphs a couple of weeks before. So he still had all of his knowledge and memories and basic skills with him to do that.
And he even described that invocation of the sylphs as just to demonstrate to Rose, like, look, isn't that nice? What does it all amount to ultimately?
Yeah, which of course is the old thing. If you brainwashed a Jungian as I am, your conscious position very often is taken up as a bulwark against what the shadow side is starting to constellate and bring forth. You get more and more skeptical, more and more laid back and materialistic just before the inner volcano erupts and says, okay, let's get going here. So that was a factor with all of this. With the stele itself, there's that one reference to it in the 3rd chapter of the Book of the Law, verse 19. It shall be known as, they shall call it the abomination of desolation, which you look at and think, why do we have to call it that? But then you realize it's actually the third person, they. Everyone else is going to say, oh my gosh, this Thelema stuff is awful and evil and dark. I still get stuff. I explain Thelema to friends of mine. A lot of the people around me in this part of Mexico, they see themselves as spiritually oriented. And then they go and try and check out Thelema. Now, Thelema does not tell you that you must be positive and generous and kind to everything. Thelema says, be real, which upsets a lot of people because they don't want to have to be real about the fact that all of us are scared and petty and sometimes just stupid. And you need to take all of those things into account. It all comes into the picture. So I still get people sending me emails. They've seen a video on YouTube or something, and they try and explain Crowley to me. And I sort of try to tactfully say, look, I've read 5 biographies of this guy at this point, maybe 6, I don't know. I have been practicing this for 3 decades. I've got some idea what he's about. You don't have to explain it. But he disturbs people because it's obvious that he's serious. It's obvious that he's coming from a place of profound insight. But it's not insight that makes people comfortable. It leaves them feeling a bit desolate because all of their well-intentioned, smiley face stuff just isn't really going to get you anywhere. You're trying to get behind the mundane ego, and if you choose all the nice stuff that is what you want to go for, then you've given control to the ego. At some point, something might break through. But I think everybody has the experience of having a profound insight and thinking, nah, I won't go that way. It's kind of like, I wasn't expecting this image to pop up. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's this whole sequence where all the amazing things that happen in Camelot come to them. Shall we go to Camelot? Like, no, we'll go somewhere else.
Yeah.
They miss the entire experience of being in this magical castle.
It's a silly place. Let's go somewhere else.
It's a silly place. Yeah, exactly. So the stele should be slightly disturbing. I think when we completely lose any sense of it nagging at us and being an entirely comfortable thing for us, then we might have lost the essence of Thelema. And even for those of us who consider ourselves to be Thelemites, there's still a certain bit of that, the abomination of desolation feeling around the stele. It's slightly disturbing. Crowley, as he talks about in Magick Without Tears, he still found certain things about the Book of the Law troublesome to him right at the end of his life. And he'd spent at that point 40 years trying to comprehend this text, trying to figure out what it was all about, reconciling himself to things, having realization after realization, training a very few truly committed people, because he tried with a lot of not so committed people who couldn't take what he was on about. So it's still going to be a little bit of a burr under the, in your sock. It's going to nudge at you as an image, as it should do. It's going to push us perhaps where we don't want to have to go all the time.
Well, I find it interesting because on that point with the way that people tend to, run into obstacles with Thelema, with the Book of the Law, with the Stelé of Revealing. It's similar to the fact that it's a regular experience for me to hear people explaining or stating what, for instance, we're not allowed to talk about the contents of the Book of the Law, or we are, because the Book of the Law says X, that means that we are supposed to feel this way or think this way. And I feel like it just basically brings up this tendency of the human being to want to have rules that they need to follow. And the reality is Thelema is breaking those down so that you take responsibility for your choices instead of so you're actively choosing things instead of just doing them because something tells you to or someone tells you to, and this sort of thing.
Yeah, that is the critical thing. Thelema is always pulling the foundations out from under us. Just when we figure that we've got it all figured out, something comes up that says, well, it's not quite like that. I find inevitably, there's a comparison in my mind here between people who surround me in Mexico who have a rather different perspective to all of us gringos living here. We, the gringo community, tend to be a little bit more analytical in our approach to everything. And, as you say, people try to derive a fixed morality from Thelema. Here's my set of rules.
Yeah.
In the Tanakh, in the Torah, there's, I think, 613 rules for pious Jews. And it's like people want to try and pull that out for themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas Thelema is always pushing you into strange places. And I know in myself, I've fought Thelema my whole time involved with it, simply because I keep getting pulled to a certain zone that is not exactly what Crowley or certain major figures in Thelema have said about the whole business. But that's what my true will is saying, that this is where you need to be for now. It doesn't mean you're going to stay here permanently, but you might need to spend 10 or 12 years pursuing a particular perspective before you can finally say, okay, that one's done.
Yeah.
One thing particular about the stele, I don't like devotional work. The very word, devotion in Thelema gave me the creeps for a long time. Yet putting the thing up in your private temple space is intrinsically a devotional act. It's saying, I will be guided by what is depicted on this illustration here. And even if you're not consciously saying things like the adorations or reciting the holy books at any given moment, you are still acknowledging that your conscious direction has to be subordinate to the superconscious direction that the images on the stelae represent.
Mm-hmm. One star in sight, so to speak.
One star in sight, and you have infinity represented by Nuit all the way around, which is an impossible concept.
Mm-hmm.
We can imagine, empty space and large distances, and right at the moment when we're recording this, there's all this stuff about Three-Eye Atlas, and I've had people literally come up to me and say, "So, what do you think about this spacecraft?" It's like I live in that kind of community, and so it's forcing people to envisage things of vast scale, but vast scale is still not the same as infinity, which is what Nuit represents to us. So you are looking at something that will always literally boggle your mind. It will boggle the ruach, that reasoning, figuring out side of yourself. The stele does that. Even Hadith seems to be a nice, definable, clear concept, but its sheer goingness, come unto me as a foolish word for a desire that go, is itself the opposite of most of what we want to do. Half of my life, it's like, I want to take a break now, or I think I'll cook some food, or I'll watch something on my computer, or read a book. I still read books. But Hadith is saying go, 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 because it's going on to the next thing and the next thing. And the star in sight, the Horus, is itself pretty much impossible to envisage. I mean, I know people who have said that their HGA is almost entirely Horusian, Horian, whatever you want to call it. One of my hardest struggles was to realize that while that concept, that imagery underlies what I'm personally doing in Thelema, my own understanding of my angel, as I have had communication with it, is not very much a hawk-headed warrior god. I'm just not into that. It's not my thing. And yet I'm drawn to this thing that is very much based around the concept. So I've always had to deal with a paradox there, which I've not been entirely able to resolve. And the answer I get always is, why do you have to resolve everything? Why cannot you just live with the fact that existence is paradoxical?
Why you know the white and you know the black, why do you seek the equivalence of them?
The equivalence, yeah, so that my knowledge may go aright, my work may go aright. I've got an excuse for this, but and it's a sound approach, but it again, I've put my ego's requirements in front of where I'm going. Devotion is probably one of the last things that comes in for most people. With Thelema at first, there's a kind of, it's fun, it's a bit transgressive, it's highly energetic, we get drawn into that. And then we begin to absorb more of the philosophy of Thelema. Finally, we start finding that there really is a hadith right at the center of all of our observations of everything. And it really is looking out at the totality of Nuit. And it's only the regular mind that is editing out most of that infinity to focus on something that we can deal with in the moment and feel comfortable with. But the stele is always implying something way beyond our capabilities, way beyond our ability to envisage. It is always saying that there is more here than a human ruach can embrace. And really, the only part of us that can really comprehend it is the neshama, this higher soul, which for most of us kind of pops in and out once every few weeks or few months. And we have to gradually let it build up the dialogue with the more obvious parts of the psyche. And it is a further journey, I think, before there's real, actual devotional work happening, which, of course, is what the stele is showing. Ank-f-n-Khonsu is making a devotional offering to the god that he feels has really been there for him throughout his life. He's supposed to be a servant of Montu, the war god. Again, going back to that French translator, he, of course, spelt Mentu, M-E-N-T-U, and I gave up a few years ago trying to persuade people that it's not meant to be pronounced as Mentu. The name was Montu, and I just let that ride for now, but that is something worth bearing in mind. But no, he is being devotional towards this deity who is the most powerful one that he knows of. He opens the gates of the sky, to quote a couple of the translations of the stele. And I really love that metaphor. The Egyptians were not particularly poetic. They tend to be very down to earth, at least the way we've translated their language. Obviously, the fact that we lost it and we only had this Coptic language that Egyptian Christians had derived from traditional ancient Egyptian means that we were always some distance away from the language. But that, to me, seems to be a particularly evocative phrase, open the gates of the sky. And, of course, that is really what each of us is trying to do, depending on what we each see as the sky. But I think the human psyche almost automatically sees the sky as the infinite, the realm of light, whereas the rest of what we're doing is the realm of stuff, and stuff tends to block or transform or refract light. So you're trying to get to that point where you can see, you can glimpse infinity, let's put it that way. And the stele with that image of Nuit around the edge is implying that that is the process that goes on here.
It's kind of funny. Makes me think of that my color is black to the blind, but the blue and gold are seen of the seeing. I usually think of blind in the negative sense, but it's like in the sense of where there's nothing that the light's refracting off of, then you see the blackness. But when it's actually bouncing off of stuff and air particles in the air, you end up with the blue and the gold and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we always do, as human beings, exist in a conditioned world. And Thelema, more than most of the esoterically minded religions, is quite comfortable with that. It's quite okay with us being here on this planet, in this world, in this manner, with these bodies that are born and grow and live and get old and are gone. Everything comes and goes. It's an awfully mundane way of describing the cosmic process, but it's very clearly stated in the holy books generally that there are things that are past and are done. There is that which remains. And the stele, again, is implying that this process of Hadith, forever reaching towards the infinite, is the process that I think remains, rather than it being a fixed thing. Any fixed thing, anything that can be described as a thing, is not what is being referred to there. All things, whether they are objects of worship or possessions or ideas or even energies, have their time and then they pass. And I think the real liberation that Thelema offers us is when we can begin to click with that finally and say, it's okay. Things pass, and so do I, and so does the world. But there is something continuing, and the idea of disaster coming, which is very fashionable at the moment in today's world,
I don't think it's ever gone out of style, frankly, but
it's never gone out of style, but it's particularly fashionable right now in the late 2025 era vulgaris. And I keep thinking that we still need to learn this thing, that there is this constant flowing and movement. Hadith is flapping its wings and moving on to another experience of the infinity of Nuit. That is one of the other messages of the stele. That is the dynamic thing happening there, this thing heading up and out infinitely, throughout all time. So the stele is nudging us in that direction and implies through its imagery that is what is so for all of us.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that like, for instance, in the Book of Lies, there's a few chapters that refer to the Trinity or triad of Nuit, Hadit, and Rahur Quit, but perpetually it seems like referring to them as sort of representatives of the three veils of Naught, as opposed to anything specific to the tree and that sort of thing. So it sort of implies that they're beyond normal conscious apprehension.
Yeah, certainly in their roots, although you might say that Crowley was exploring a particular idea there that had come to him after years of working with this system. Mm-hmm. You always have to allow for the fact that it's not that he's hammering the same point again and again. It's the fact that fresh understanding was coming to him all of the time. His Hadith was always reaching out for the greater Nuit. And therefore what came to him via his own holy guardian angel, his own Rahul Kawit, which of course was Aiwas, whose limited amount we have about that HGA is that it was a sort of Sumerian figure with a bluish character. It's not Horus at all. So like all of us, he was not absolutely doctrinarily locked into the specific imagery of the stele. It lays out the principles. It doesn't lay out a dogma. And there he pushed into something that goes further. And probably we'd have to be masters of the temple to understand just what that implies. We can grasp it intellectually, the three negative veils. But I think there he was chasing after something he had glimpsed, or maybe more than glimpsed, in his own private work. There's still, I was complaining a while ago about people who watch YouTube videos and tell me what Crowley was about. The fact is that there's a lot of his internal development that is not tightly documented. Some of it has been kept secret, I think, or away from the public eye because it might pertain to specific mysteries of the OTO, fair enough. But there was always that constant unfolding happening for him. And periodically he would pull it together in a letter or a lecture or one of the holy books or something, one of the later texts, such as the Book of Lies or Liber Aleph, which came rather later than his early phase. But it was always unfolding for him. And trying to appreciate that there are going to be things that will make sense to us at one point and then cease to have definite relevance later on is not that we've fallen away from Thelema, but we've actually allowed it to open us out. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, which is, I think that makes it tricky when it comes to spiritual, like, aha moments, when you have those really big moments that seem ultra important in the moment, and maybe they are at that time and place, but getting the sense of how that evolves over time, and as you've said, that may be what's going on for you at this particular time, but later on down the road, you'll be in a different place with a different experience.
There was something I tacked on to my notes for this afternoon's talk. happened to me about 20 years ago. I think I've told you this story personally, but I don't think I've used it on a Darkly Splendid Abodes broadcast. Mm-hmm. It was when I went to Barcelona back in 2004, and the sacred mountain north of that is Montserrat. It means the serrated mountain. The rocks around it are sculpted in extraordinary ways, and people have nicknames for the different ones. That's Bernal the horse, that's the parrot, that's the mummy, that's the mushroom. And these things literally look like these names people have given the thing. Mm. And it rises up a couple of thousand feet above the surrounding countryside. On a clear day, you can easily see the Mediterranean from the top. And I'm told that on a super clear day, you can still sometimes see the island of Mallorca way out over the Mediterranean. Anyway, I went there in an August day that was super hot in Barcelona. But when we got to the mountain itself, you go up about 3,500 feet. So it dropped a comfortable number of degrees. It was still shirt sleeve weather, but comfortable enough to walk around. Now, the whole thing about the Montserrat is that there's this legendary discovery of a statue of the Virgin and Jesus. 700s or 800s. The legend tends to vary a bit. And when Napoleon's troops were there 200 years ago, they managed to burn some of the records, so we've lost some stuff. Anyway, the existing statue is from the late 1100s, and it has the Virgin. It's about 30 inches high. She's got an orb in her hands and Jesus on her knees. He's got a pine cone in his hand, left hand, which is a really interesting pagan symbol of fertility and eternity. It makes me believe that perhaps the original statue they found was not a Christian one at all. Mm-hmm. We do know that there was a shrine to the goddess Venus that the Romans had at this hill. So I'm guessing that way before that, there was some other faith that had a shrine there. Mm. Anyway, you go up a long line, and then you have to go up some stairs. This image is over the altar at the far eastern part of the church. And I can remember going there and thinking, okay, there's all these notices saying, please don't talk, and everyone's jabbering away. And suddenly as you get to the stairs, it was like a silence descended. And then I saw, oh, there's the cash box. The Catholic Church wants money.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'll just give them the change in my pocket. So I pulled it out. What have I got? Okay, I've got €1, that's 100 cents, and a 50 cents, and a 5 and a 1. I had 156 European cents. And I thought, oh, that's wicked. And at that moment, it was one of those things where I won't say I heard, I felt as much as heard, something that said, that's right.
Wow.
And I could feel everything inside me sort of reorienting, like, I'm going to put that money in here. Okay, we're dealing with a Binar figure. Let's treat it as a Binar figure. Now, what you do is you go up, you stand in front of it. There's a glass barrier around most of the statue to stop people scratching bits off for themselves, taking souvenirs or doing damage. But you do touch the Madonna's right hand that's holding this orb. Now, it was my turn. There was a woman in front of me. She was absolutely awestruck and was trying to take a photo, so I let her finish that. And then it was my turn. Okay, sort of staring at this thing, thinking, interesting medieval artwork. Okay, I'll just touch the hand. I don't know what happened for the next, it was less than 2 seconds. I was gone from this plane somewhere. I didn't go to heaven. I didn't go to the other place. I have no idea what I specifically went to visit, but I was in another plane of understanding altogether for those few brief moments and was completely exalted for the rest of that day. I just remember walking around the top of this mountain. It's big. It's several kilometers long and a few kilometers wide. I only got around part of it because it would take all day to do the whole thing. And it has some old abandoned medieval hermitages, and there's all kinds of little things you can discover in the scenery. But I thought this is another example of something that, had meant something to me, that connected intimately with my own process. Mm-hmm. I came across something when I was looking this up not long ago with a woman who'd had a similar experience. She touched the thing, walked on, then looked back and said, I was just hit by an incredible wave of love. Now, that was a Christian person having an experience of their own path through life. Mine has been much more around looking for sacred power. And that was what I think I experienced, the point where the barriers were gone and you can experience anything for a few moments. And I had an experience of what Babylon would be, and it's perhaps maybe not its very highest aspect, but something along the way to that. So imagery does get invested with a genuine energy, because you've got thousands of people who go to this statue every day, and they've been doing that for 1,100 years, except for a couple of periods of warfare. It's just constantly bombarded with hope, expectation, and the stuff from people like myself, because there were a whole load of Asian tourists there that day that I'm quite sure were not all Christian. But they were going to see this thing, and they knew it was something sacred, and they'd heard you should go and see this. This relates back to the stele in the way that any particular image can become imbued with something strong and purposeful, full of meaning, whether or not it consciously ties in with your belief system or not. And I'm sure that many Thelemites might have other personal images that are part of their own pursuit of their own journey. So I think the stele needs to be respected as something that, yes, does present orthodox Thelema. Here's the foundations of it to us, but it also needs to be respected as something that still has things to communicate to us at certain times that we might not have thought of before, or might previously have pushed aside because they're just we're not ready for them. They're not comfortable to us. We think that's wrong doctrine and so on. But Thelema is far, far more than just glomming onto some set of ideas that Aleister Crowley explained 100 years ago. It's taking those and finding where we can discover them in more than one place. And I think that is how the Aeon will continue to unfold as it does. Not in any particularly public way, but with people finding more and more of what is depicted in the stele and was first presented through the stele to Aleister and Rose, to help them develop an understanding stripped of the usual kinds of dogmas and moralistic prescriptions that we use to blind ourselves to the essential direction coming through us from the very center of our own being.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I have nothing I could say that wouldn't do anything but just drag that sentiment down. I think it was a really beautiful conception of the stele.
Well, thank you. I don't know where it came from either. That's not something from my notes for today. But I think if you tune into this stuff, eventually it does start to speak through. The same way that image in Barcelona, north of Montserrat, it's not in Barcelona, it's 40 kilometers north of the city. had something to say to me on that particular August day.
Yeah, well, I'm glad Napoleon's men didn't fire cannonballs at it like they did in Egypt.
The monks realized he was coming, and they smuggled the statue away and hid it in a cave. As I say, it's quite a big mountain, and it's very much sculpted by the wind. There's a huge number of hiding places. I think if you went and stayed on the mountain, there is a hotel there. It's supposed to be just for pilgrims, but I'm sure you could find an awful lot of stuff that I never saw in 5 hours on this place. But it still stays with me as one of those moments when I touch one of the true sacred sites and thought, yeah, this is the cool stuff.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Edward. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was a pleasure. We'll do this again sometime, huh?
Absolutely. So we'll talk to you soon. 93.
93.
Thanks for listening. Find Toronto Thelema online. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and help us grow. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.